All right, so I am Jill Grobel. I am the events chair for Digital Women Kansas City. I am joined today by Jennifer Brown, our president, and Noor Naseer from Centro. She's our senior director of media innovations and technology. We're really excited to kind of kick off the event series for 2021 and really welcome dialogue and welcome all of you. So today we're going to talk about very briefly DWKC's mission and some goals that we've established for 2021. We'll go into our presentation and then we have left room at the end for Q&A. Please, if you have specific questions, put those in the chat. I've got some questions for Noor at the end that will kind of spark our dialogue at the end of this hour. So thank you again for joining us. So we wanted to kind of just restate our mission as Digital Women of Kansas City, and that is to really educate and empower women to succeed in digital and really in life. I have really enjoyed being a part of Digital Women Kansas City. The first event that I went to was back when we actually had in-person events in 2019 and really started to be actively involved with the organization in 2020. And I have been so delighted to meet so many women from different organizations, different backgrounds, different professional capabilities. I think the fact that we're very open, we're very collaborative. We really believe that we want to help others in terms of understanding the world of digital and how it's continuing to evolve and how we can support and grow together. So this year, going into 2021, we really wanted to establish some key goals for our organization, but also for our events that we are creating and that we're going to be having on a monthly basis. And then we'll have events that are going on a quarterly basis too. And our three key goals for the year are pretty simple. Get, grow, and give back. So when you are working with us, when you are participating with us, we want to make sure that you're gaining something, you're getting something, you're getting relevant information, knowledge, and education. We also want to offer the opportunity for growth, right? Growing your professional careers, but also personally. And then an opportunity to give back, working with our community, with our partners, and offering service, whether that be your time, your talent, or your treasure. So you'll see that our events and our content is really set up against these goals this year. So just lastly, we do have some upcoming events that are happening. On February 23rd, we're going to have a diversity, equity, and inclusion panel event that's at noon. We also have an emerging media series. This is the first of our emerging media series events. We'll also be having one on March 11th and April 8th, so the second Thursday of the month. And also right now we are actively recruiting new board members. I will put that in the link shortly. We are looking for board members for digital as well as the sponsorship role. So we are very excited to put that out there and excited to hear from you if you're interested in that. So at this point, I'm excited to introduce our featured speaker today. And I've got a little information on her as we introduce her. And Noor, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, I will introduce you. So Noor Naseer, I'm very excited to have her here today. She's a leader of innovations and client education at an ad tech software and services company, Centro. She's guiding clients nationally on how to improve and evolve their media and marketing plans to accommodate our ever-changing consumer behaviors and advertising trends. She's also the host of an ad tech podcast, which is called Adtech Unfiltered, and I will share that as well in the link shortly, and has been cited in and written for various industry outlets, including Adweek, Media Post, Advertising Week, and Mobile Marketer. She's spoken at events for the 4As and the American Marketing Association. And she is a leader of Centro's diversity, equity, and inclusion programming and initiatives. Prior to Centro, Noor served in media roles for Procter & Gamble and BlackBerry at Starcom Media Best Group. She's a graduate of Northwestern University with an MS in integrated marketing. So welcome, Noor. We're really happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Jill, and thanks everyone for joining us for the session. Just hearing the mission of Digital Women of Kansas City, it really warms my heart that you guys have created this localized space for women. And I know that digital, the word digital by itself can mean a lot of different things. So at least for the purposes of today's presentation and how I'm going to be approaching the conversation, it's going to be focused on thinking about the trends pertaining to digital media and specifically paid media. So hopefully this is going to be interesting for everybody who has made the time to join us today, and excited to take questions and also have some conversation. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get moving. So just at a high level, since many of you may not be familiar with Centro, which is a company that I've worked at now for almost a decade, we very much specialize in paid media and specifically leveraging advertising technology so that you can deploy and expedite the way that you plan, build a strategy, and do all the different steps that have to do with building a digital media plan. So I'm not going to run through everything that's written on the slide, but the one point I'll mention at the end is on top of doing that work, we have a strong and I think needed commitment to education. And so a session like this is something that really brings me tremendous joy to participate in. So with that, let's talk about the things that we're going to be covering off on in today's presentation. I don't think we can talk about this year without first at least addressing last year. So a couple of reflections on last year, followed by the trends of 2021. And I think the core trend that we're really going to focus in on is the concept of acceleration. We'll get more into the details in a little bit. And then we'll end with some takeaways because we're going to go through a lot of different slides pretty quickly. And then we're finally, like we mentioned earlier, going to end on Q&A. So I think we can all attest to this, that 2020 was a year that was very virtual for a series of different reasons. This is a very meta experience in this moment, right? I have a slide about video conferencing as we all use a video conference tool in this very moment. No surprise how big this stat is highlighting itself. There was a 30 times growth rate in video conferencing between 2019 and 2020 because this is how we communicate now. So that was one of the core big changes to living in a virtual environment. And in addition to us all working from home, we're also now learning from home. One of the biggest ways that we're thinking about learning home primarily focuses on children. So another stat, 93% of school-aged children engage in some form of e-learning. In many cases, it's hybrid, but this has definitely become a part of their daily lifestyles as well. Also, an interesting point is the fact that as it related to entertainment and knowing that people could no longer engage in communal spaces, and also sports, people like to engage. I know the Super Bowl just happened pretty recently and there were a lot of attendees there, but in 2020, engagement had fallen starkly. So we were turning to different forms of entertainment that were also virtual. So online gaming, esports, and also the concept of virtual concerts. This visual here is something that's been pulled from a virtual or a social platform rather for Travis Scott. He had a concert that was attended virtually by over 12.3 million people. So a lot of people hungry for those experiences that they otherwise would have had in real life, but they were open to an alternative solution that was virtual. And then as far as the more traditional home entertainment, that also hit new levels. There was a 20% increase in streaming digital video over 2 additional hours. I think for a lot of people, it might have been much more than 2 additional hours, but this is just going to show the fact that there were many changed behaviors and that many of those changed behaviors have sustained themselves moving into this year. So that's a quick look from a consumer perspective. Let's talk about things from the angle of advertising trends. So just a couple of very high level things. I've focused on 2 particular lines from this eMarketer chart. And we're really looking at one thing that's super obvious, that there was a dip, right? A dip between not last year, but the year prior to last year, so 2019, between 2019 and 2020, there was a negative growth of 4%. Understood, expected. A lot of people weren't anticipating all the economic ramifications that would lead them to having to spend less in advertising. But then this year, there's really this unprecedented expectation for people to be spending in the advertising space significantly greater than they have in past years. So the expectation is that we're going to grow from 2020 into this year, a growth rate overall in advertising at 16%. So it's a big year to spend in the space, but then the question becomes, how do you do it in the most thoughtful and strategic way possible with consideration for all the trends that we were talking about just a couple of slides ago? And what are the sources of that growth? What are the different things that people are doing that are really enabling smart ways to take advantage of those consumer trends? A lot of the areas of growth are highlighted on this slide, specifically from sources of driving digital-oriented growth. I'm not going to go through each one of these either. I think we can all just eyeball these quickly, but the places I really want to call out are pertaining to sight, sound, and motion. So the biggest space of growth, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, is connected to connected television. Because of all that streaming that people are doing, there's an expectation that media buyers, people who are responsible for marketing and advertising plans, that there's going to be a growth rate in that category of over 40%. So just a couple of trends there from a consumer standpoint before we move into a couple of things in particular that we think advertisers and marketers are going to be thinking about with a lot more clarity and depth moving into this year. So what are those trends that we're going to touch on today? I said that the trend of the day, or rather the topic, the theme of the day, is acceleration. So these are spaces that I think we've all heard of. They're not debuting in 2021, but that they have become bigger, and the size with which a lot of advertisers are going to be spending in those spaces is really what is accelerating. So those spaces are streaming, so streaming television and video, followed by audio, social, and then finally identity and privacy. We'll talk about different ways to think about these spaces and a couple of the stats and trends pertaining to each one of them. So starting off with streaming, let's talk about how that has accelerated. We really already kind of have in those previous slides. Just want to touch on it in a little more detail in a way that I think is quite interesting. So on this particular slide, there is a gray line that is highlighting how many Americans were consuming OTT or over-the-top streaming content in 2020 and 2021, all the way up until 2024. These were original projections prior to the pandemic taking place. And then there is a revised line, which is that gold or yellow line that is above it, and it's showcasing how things have actually changed given everything that's transpired with people being in quarantine and the pandemic. So with that increased focus on escapism, we just want to look at the numbers underneath 2021. The original projection for this year was that roughly 200 million Americans were primarily viewing streaming content, but that's now been revised to being 210, close to 210 million Americans. And if you look all the way at the end of the gray line, that number of people consuming this type of content wasn't forecasted until 2024. So I think this is a perfect illustration of that form of acceleration and suggesting the fact that maybe an advertiser who wasn't thinking of investing here in this year, maybe that's something they wanted to push off until the future. This is a suggestion that it's probably more relevant for them to think about it now and not hold off until later down the road. Another quick point as it relates to just thinking specifically about this style of streaming television by comparison to other forms of streaming, or rather other types of video experiences, is just highlighting the fact that there's been a pretty steady degradation in how much people are consuming traditional forms of content. So the overall point here is that many of the traditional providers have seen a steady decline, and that decline is continuing to take place year over year. It doesn't mean that traditional linear television isn't going to continue to be important, but that degradation is something to also keep an eye out for, especially for clients, advertisers, and marketers that like to spend in these spaces. And then this point here is pertaining to the concept of the streaming wars. I think many of us on the line right now have heard about the streaming wars ad nauseum for the last couple of years, maybe last several years, but it's really heated up in, I'd say, the last 18 to 24 months. And what I think I find a lot of people saying is that most of that consumption they feel is coming from SVOD or subscription only video on demand streaming services. So like the Netflixes, the Disney Pluses, the Prime Videos of the world, they have not only the largest subscriber bases, but that, hey, there's no ads that are available there. But what's interesting is that I think some of that is really being disproven by all the AVOD or ad-supported / AVODs and subscription-oriented streaming services that are out there. So I have a series of examples, including Tubi, Peacock, Pluto, Hulu, which I think most of us are very familiar with, and Roku, and many more. So it's just interesting to see that the tides really are turning very steeply in favor of AVOD. And this is in no way full representation of all the streaming services that are out there. But I think for illustration purposes, it shows that there's a healthy volume of available services to think about, and that there's an opportunity to think about it from a strategic media perspective as well. Something interesting on this slide is just highlighting the fact that there has been a revised look at how people were thinking people were going to be consuming and or rather spending their media dollars against linear television versus how things are actually netting out. So I've got a bunch of pie charts on this slide, so I'll try to break this down as simplistically as possible. There were original actualized numbers on the far left based on this study from eMarketer. They were saying that overall advertisers and marketers were spending about close to 40% of their dollars in linear television, meaning traditional TV. And the rest of their dollars were going to a variety of offline and online / digital media types. And then they were projecting at that time, and the time that these original projections on the left were put together was 2019, so 2 years ago. They were suspecting that by 2023, that television would be making up only 23% of the pie. So this was an original projection, so I'm sure a lot of advertisers thought, yeah, it's smaller, still really significant. But then if you look on the far right, we see there's this revised outlook that was just released this year. It wasn't put together by eMarketer, but it was released by the IAB. They have a consolidation of a variety of media buyers that were surveyed, and they asked them the question, where are you planning on spending your dollars moving into the future? And so what they said for this year is that they're expecting that only 15%, on average, only 15% of their dollars would actually be spent in traditional television. And then that blue slice is representing how many dollars they're planning on spending in the digital video space, which is inclusive of streaming spaces. So it's really getting neck and neck for what was once the king of mass media, which is television. So just interesting things to reflect on. Another point that I often hear just talking about any type of emerging technology is the fact that sometimes advertisers have fears around emerging technologies, feeling that, listen, we get it works for some generations, but not the types of audiences that I seek to reach. And I think what's interesting about this slide is that it's highlighting the fact that specifically in this time of extended quarantine or just spending much more time at home, despite there being, yes, millennials, let's say, based on this slide, we're seeing a really high propensity for that particular demographic group consuming, and also Gen X. But some of the other generations are really catching up in terms of the volume of millions of consumers there too. So it just goes to show that there's healthy rhyme and reason to think about connected TV as a legitimate and viable opportunity for reaching a variety of different types of demos. So just a couple of takeaways from this particular section, that just, of course, content and consumption is growing at accelerated rates because of how much people are consuming. And then also all these streaming players, they're doing a lot of work to make sure there is a volume and variety of different types of original and syndicated content. So people are, one thing is like feeding the other thing, and it's leading there to being the second category, that there really is a good opportunity to test the potential for sight, sound, and motion, and that those audiences are truly both scalable and also of high quality. One last point to mention that we didn't get into for this trends presentation is that there is room and reason for there to be an improvement of measurement. I think that's really on the horizon. The Nielsen's and the ComScores of the world are working really hard to figure out how do we create a universal measurement system that better reflects what we historically had in the traditional TV space. So more to come on that, but I think we're getting closer to it than we ever have before. So that's our first trend. Moving into our second, which is about audio. So people are consuming digital audio also at unprecedented rates. This year, the expectation is that there are going to be close to 87 million consumers of digital audio, up from 81.6 million last year. So it's a kind of a decent increase of a little over 6%. And a lot of that growth is specifically being driven from podcast consumption. I have to say that's true for myself. So speaking a little bit more about podcasting, so this is a stat that was released by Spotify, and specifically for, well, first I'll mention this. They were saying for the podcast space, there was a 108% increase in podcast listening over 2019 for last year. We're seeing that type of growth moving into this year as well. And then additionally for the news and political space, no surprise, last year there was a 140% increase in that category. So there are many different types of programming to listen to, but of course last year was an election year and people were really dialed into some spaces. And I think that momentum is continuing to grow moving into the future. And then thinking about podcasts, not just from the consumption standpoint, but also from the advertising implication standpoint. Here we're looking at how much advertisers have been spending in the podcasting space. So the expectation is that it's going to be 1.28 billion, so close to $1.3 billion spent in podcast advertising in 2021. Tons of spend there. They're also saying that that equates to 1/4 of all digital audio spending is going to podcasting, which I think is a big step of growth compared to past years when there just wasn't as much scale out there. And then specifically at Centro, what we've noted inside of our technology is that the growth rate in ad spending in this category is actually so significantly greater than many other categories. Compared to last year, we've seen a 500% growth rate. And as you can see, we're able to lean into a lot of the different types of publishers that I think many of us who are podcast listeners are most commonly turning to. So a couple of takeaways on this space, that the time spent and the dollars that people are spending from an advertising standpoint are increasing significantly, that there's good rhyme and reason, again, to think about it from a media investment standpoint, and that the source from which a lot of that growth is transpiring is specifically attributed to podcasting. So moving from there into our third trend, which is about social and the acceleration in that category. Lots to talk about here too. I think this is another space that people have really doubled down on, similar to the other categories you've spoken to. People are at home, but they still want to socialize, and turning to different types of social channels has been a good way in which they can continue to connect meaningfully. So if you look at the chart on the left, they're highlighting the growth of monthly active users across a series of many of the most popular social platforms that we're all familiar with. At the very bottom, we see Twitter, followed by the volume and growth in Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Pinterest, and finally TikTok, where there has been the steepest volume of growth. So let's talk a little bit more about TikTok, because that really has become the big trend associated with quarantine and 2020 and now moving into 2021. They saw last year that there was an 85% jump in the number of monthly active users. They surpassed the number of users that leverage Twitter, really one of the hailing and classic social media platforms, and that they are gaining ground on both Snapchat and Pinterest. So tons of growth there. So let's talk a little bit more about TikTok. I think there's going to be some audio on this next slide. Some of you guys might have seen this guy, maybe. He's a popular TikToker, a lot of popularity with his videos. I struggle to speak over these videos. These are embedded into the into these slides. Okay, there we go. maybe you guys have seen this video as well, or you know this woman as an influencer. She focuses on vegan recipes and cooking, but just highlighting what does that, how much time is being spent specifically on TikTok compared to Facebook, which really has one of the largest volumes of usership. So in terms of use on an hourly basis or number of hours per month, TikTok is seeing people using the app an average of 21.5 hours compared to Facebook usage of just a little under 18. So tons of usage, tons of application, and a great way to socialize with people in ways that Facebook just can't quite offer, and specifically to some of the demos that have really leaned into it. So I think that opens the door to another type of conversation, which is focus on content creation. I don't know that people think about Facebook per se with necessarily creation on the mind the same way that they are in some of these new iterations of social media platforms, TikTok being one of them. There is a tremendous reliance on UGC or user-generated content, and people feel excited, energized, and just incentivized to build that type of content and to share with others. There also is this idea of there being brand content versus fan-based content. So that being that of just like actual organic influencers, and that there is this more of a openness to things not necessarily being super polished in the way that advertisers and marketers traditionally are trying to portray themselves and the types of creative that they're developing. So sometimes that fan style content that with a little bit less polished, not as much production value, is actually being seen sometimes as more authentic and even acceptable for brands to participate in. So at the bottom, we have a stat: 92% of consumers trust organic UGC more than they trust traditional advertising. And I think it's because of the perception that if it's not as glossy, if there isn't that high shine and it hasn't been traditionally produced, that there is maybe more of an openness to consuming it, which I think goes against the grain of how some more traditional advertisers and marketers think about presenting themselves. And along those lines, I think this is an interesting thing to note as far as even aligning with that previous slide, as far as accepting something for being more authentic. Here's a point: more than 2/3 of marketers plan to use influencer marketing. And these were some projections moving into the future, specifically as it pertained to reaching Generation Z and then also millennials. So here we have a ranking for both Gen Z and millennials of which types of advertising and marketing they were most receptive to. In both categories, social media posts from influencers were perceived as the ones that they were most open to consuming to learn about new products, followed by a series of more traditional types of media. And here is a slide I had quickly pulled from a brand that was very traditionally a classic popular brand from when I was young, Abercrombie and Fitch. Clearly they're still out there. What I thought was really interesting here is that you know, young up and coming people that wanted to become part of some sort of like celebrity or popular culture, they would be looking to appeal to Abercrombie to see if they could become models or spokespeople, something of that nature. There was a traditional hierarchy of how you would get involved with a brand. And now in today's world, Abercrombie is leaning out to these younger content creators and asking them so that they can maintain and just improve their brand equity with the audiences they seek to reach to. So as you can see actually, and it's not quite visible based on the way that I did the screenshot, but one of the content creators, he is tagged Dale Sampson, and the woman on the right actually is too. It's just being blocked by that rewards are waiting for you sign. So it's just an interesting change of events and how important it is to be perceived authentically and to be aligned with people that you know, consumers trust. So a couple of takeaways for this category. It's a great time to explore different platforms for the unique types of opportunities that they all offer. Oftentimes we're thinking about things from a paid lens, but there's plenty of room to think about it also from an owned and earned perspective as well. I think putting in the strategic time to reflect on how you can connect more authentically is critical. And this was kind of embedded or implied through a lot of the past slides we went through. Video is definitely a requirement for enabling that, to engender that type of trust. and that there's also a lot of room and space to discover new types of audiences that are available and that can enable performance, but ultimately it needs to be tested. And then our final category, one of the heftiest categories out here, and I think so much time and energy is going to be spent on this in 2021, is what is happening in the identity space. So I think the quick and simple way of addressing identity, and where I guess you could say the concern and the interest lies, is on this singular point, that Google Chrome, which is now the reigning and now singular web browser out there that is still maintaining cookies, they are expected to drop them by 2021. So that's later this year. It's not a hard date. There isn't a hard date there, but that's at least what we're expecting, if not early 2022. So that's a big area of concern, because so many advertisers and marketers are reliant on cookies in order to serve ads effectively and leverage a lot of the digital tactics that they're traditionally using. And there's a lot of different things going on. There's really layered concerns as it pertains to identifiers. Starting on the left, what happened to, there we go. It was a build, guys. I was missing that point on the far left. Loss of third-party cookies, one that I just mentioned on the previous slide. Most third-party cookies, like we just spoke about moments ago, will become unavailable, we anticipate, by the end of the year. That's also going to have a reflection on other types of probabilistic IDs that we have traditionally also leaned on from an ad signal standpoint. So one thing is eroding another thing that also helps us build audiences. It's also having an impact on mobile IDs. So IDFA, which is an ID that's used by advertisers, and then also Apple advertising ID. They're lacking cohesion with this erosion of cookie support. There were already issues to begin with, but there's going to be a further degradation. And then on top of all of that, all of this reactive work that that's impacting all of these different players, or how they're choosing to move forward in a more privacy compliant world. There's also the legislative angle that we really need to think about, which I think there's the chicken and the egg. Is this a reaction to that? Are people trying to get prepared by shifting the way that they're offering their products? I think it's definitely both. So some of that regulative concern that's out there is pertaining to abiding by GDPR, which has been around for a few years, and pertaining to the European Union, CCPA, which was passed for California residents a few years ago and went into effect in January 2020. And finally, CPRA, which many people are referring to as CCPA 2.0, which is more stringent and strict rules around the type of data that can be collected and that impacts all advertisers. So it could take us hours and hours. This is a trends presentation to really break everything down. But just at a high level, what are some of the things that we're thinking about as it relates to what advertisers are thinking about and marketers pertaining to the future of the identity space? So to break it down on a more simplistic level, thinking about things through the lens of a consumer is that users are slowly but surely getting more control and understanding if and how their data is being collected. So on the left, we're seeing something that I think was a prompt that we were more familiar with receiving. There's a cookie consent form at the bottom of the page. And in many cases, this is what was presented to us: accept and close, as in there's no other option. You accept it and you close it, or you accept it or you refuse it. But you didn't really have that much more information on exactly what you were passing along. Now it's pretty consistent. It's really formulaic across just websites across the web, is that we're seeing these spaces that are focused on choice and control. So there are strictly necessary cookies. And if you note on both of the examples on the right side of the slide, there's no option to remove those because those are just essential cookies to the functionality of the site. But then there are other types of cookies that are of the benefit to the page creator that is enabling them. And so there is some ability to control if you do or don't want that information to be passed along. So that's something that's of benefit to consumers, but incidentally, advertisers and marketers have become so accustomed to just getting that when people were visiting sites. So a big shift on what's happening out in the digital world. Some other things to take note of: I mentioned about CPRA taking effect in the future, and there being more stringent rules and guidelines that just advertisers and brands and marketers need to be taking heed to. Most of that is going to take effect in 2023. So there's some time there, but there are responsibilities that businesses need to build out more specific opt-out forms so that if and when they're collecting information, they're doing it in an appropriate way. And then if they don't, there's going to be these increased penalties for the collection of data that is forbidden and that has not been explicitly asked for. And also even just the simple sharing of data. I think something that people were working around historically was to say, well, if you can't sell it, but we'll just share it. We'll just share it along with other products. But now even that isn't a technicality that people can lean on. Even just the simple sharing of it when it otherwise has not been specifically and explicitly asked for is something that advertisers can't do. Additional things that we need to forecast for and that I think are coming down the pike are that right now we're looking at things from a state law perspective. It's impacting all of us, but it's technically not a regulation for every state. I think we're very quickly moving into a world in which there are going to be federal laws that impact everybody in the US, and there's going to be more stringency associated with that as well. And then finally, we're going to have to turn to alternative forms of identification. So I want to talk about that a little bit more on our last few slides. So as far as there being a revision in addressability, we really on this particular slide, we can see on the outer edges, on the far left and far right, there are things that we cannot address, we simply can't address them. And then on the far right, we can see that there's also third-party audiences that we've long relied on because we were able to collect data through the use of cookies because we were enabled to get this cross-site tracking. And that enabled us to stitch together information, build audiences that were attractive to brands and advertisers. That style of collection without permission with the use of cookies is something that will no longer be facilitated in a somewhat near future. So where do we have permission? Let's focus on that. There's going to be opportunity to still access different types of audiences, but in one category on the left in the middle, we can see there is this idea of the privacy sandbox. So we have visibility, but there's a little bit of a lack of clarity around exactly who we're talking to. So more relevant, but maybe not the degree of specificity that we're accustomed to. And then just right, but still in the middle, we see first-party audiences and getting that explicit permission to target. You're getting that authentication of knowing that that person has shared information with you, and now you can continue that conversation with them. So it puts more responsibility on the brand or the advertiser or the business, but you are enabling that type of communication in a way that is lawful. So these are the areas that I think a lot of advertisers and again, brands, marketers, and businesses need to put their eggs into those baskets. So using that as we go into the takeaways, consumer expectations are really shifting as privacy rights continue to grow, and we can expect more and more privacy rights and regulations to come to the forefront moving into the future. Also, advertisers, they just need to take note of how they're collecting data, how they're utilizing it, and ensuring that they're setting themselves up for success for forthcoming legislation that will be enacted and that they will be responsible for, and that there should be a lot of focus on that collection of that first-party data, and then also just analyzing if there are types of third-party data, not connecting to third-party cookies, but the collection of third-party data that is permissible to use. Is that being impacted in any way? Because if you think back to that slide that I was showcasing about the layers of identifiers and one thing impacting the other, talking to any types of different types of data solution partners that you work with, asking them if there's an expectation for any type of impact is something that I think is critical to do. So in summary, we talked about a lot of different trends. I said, we'll be going through a lot of different slides, but what are some things to reflect on and take away from this presentation today? For each one of the categories we spoke about, starting off with CTV or streaming television and video. This is a great time to go ahead and start testing bigger budgets or just budgets at all to test and learn how the streaming video space can be a way to more meaningfully reach viewers, whether you spend traditionally in the traditional TV space or if you just haven't tested there to begin with. That's where consumers are, so meet them where they're at, followed by testing also the array of audio opportunities out there. Podcast usage is growing significantly, and so it's really an important occasion to see what can you do out there as it continues to popularize so you can build a smart strategy. And then also thinking about social and making that experience one that is going to be resonating with different types of audiences. I think social is another space that's appealing to many different types of audiences. I actually deliberately selected influencers that were not 15-year-olds doing dances because I think the appeal for TikTok is not something, maybe we've historically thought about it from the standpoint of reaching a much younger generation like Gen Z, but I think there's rhyme and reason to reach all different types of generations. You just don't want to join the party too late. So thinking about how to reach and discover meaningful audiences and influencers, it's a good time to do that now. And reflecting on how video in that vertical format, that's another thing that I think many advertisers, brands, and businesses have been lagging on. So another opportunity there. And then finally, preparing for the future of these privacy laws. And most importantly, if there has been a delay in thinking about first-party data capture and what are some of those legal ways to abide by these new privacy regulations, but still have that meaningful connection, it's going to take a lot of time and energy. So if that's been put on the back burner, prioritizing that today. And that is it on my end. So now we wanted to save some time for questions.
Yes, thank you so much. So much amazing information, and the just really being able to understand kind of the shifts in 2020 and how that's really affecting us in 2021 and what we need to accelerate and really be aware